As everyone's coming in, hi everyone. We're going to give it another minute or two before we get started. But while you guys are here, if you'd like to start introducing yourself in the chat, let us know where you guys are coming from. That'd be much appreciated. Okay, since it is 12, we will go ahead and get started. So again, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Research and Clinical Trials May Roundtable. Again, if you'd like to take a second, introduce yourself in the chat. While you guys are doing that, my name is Brianna McNulty, and I am the staff lead for this work group. Sneha, Shannon, if you guys want to unmute real quick, introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sneha Fadki. I'm an associate professor at the University of Iowa and a breast medical oncologist, and I'm one of the co-chairs of this group.
And my name is Shannon Benson. I'm the other co-chair for the group, and I'm the executive director of clinical trials at Mission Cancer and Blood in Des Moines.
Perfect. Thanks, y'all. So I'd also like to take a moment to review the charter for this work group. So the purpose of the Iowa Cancer Consortium Research and Clinical Trials Work Group is to identify and connect cancer research stakeholders and advocates in Iowa, as well as to identify opportunities for education and collaboration. Work group membership is open to any Iowa Cancer Consortium member, and anyone may participate in work group meetings. Meetings currently consist of Iowa Cancer Clinical Trials virtual roundtables, which provide an interactive forum for participants to learn from experts and peers and discuss issues related to conducting cancer clinical trials. Attendance is free and open to anyone, including research administrators and coordinators, healthcare providers and admin, public health practitioners, survivors, advocates, and anyone else with an interest and/or stake in cancer clinical trials. So for this month's roundtable, we wanted to highlight some really amazing examples of research and clinical trials happening right now. So starting us off is going to be Dr. Jessica Gorzelitz, and Dr. Gorzelitz is an assistant professor of health promotion in the Department of Health and Human Physiology at the University of Iowa. She also holds an appointment in the Department of Obstetrics, I apologize if I mispronounced that, and Gynecology, and is a full member of Cancer Epidemiology and Population Sciences program at the Holden Comprehensive Cancer Center. Her research focuses on exercise and physical activity in cancer survivorship using both epidemiologic and behavioral intervention approaches. At the University of Iowa, she directs the Physical Activity and Cancer Survivorship Lab, where she uses distance-delivered behavioral change approaches to advance physical activity behaviors in individuals with a cancer history. Joining us as well is Dr. Rima Afifi. Rima is a professor in the Department of Community and Behavioral Health and is the director of the Prevention Research Center for Rural Health at the College of Public Health and University of Iowa. Her research and practice focus on mental health, refugee and immigrant well-being, substance use, and intervention evaluation. She advocates for an emphasis on social, structural, and commercial determinants of health to promote equity and justice. Rima's passion is to work with adolescents and young adults to craft environments conducive to their well-being. With that being said, Dr. Gorzelitz, if you'd like to start us off.
Okie dokie. Thanks so much, Bri. And hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. And thanks to the work group for allowing me to present today. I love my work and I'm always happy to talk about it. So I just want to briefly start off by talking about clinical trials and my role as a physical activity behavior specialist working with cancer survivors. And oftentimes when I'm working with folks and we talk about clinical trials with patients, with lay people, like when I talk to my parents, when I say clinical trials, they're almost always thinking about Grey's Anatomy or ER, and therapeutic approaches are the thing that often come front of mind. But I'd like to start off my talk and explain that the NIH views clinical trials broadly, that it is defined as any prospective allocation of a biomedical treatment, whether that is behavioral, biomedical, targeting any one of these components. So for example, drug trials are often one of the key parts of clinical trials that folks are aware of, that is often meant to improve a clinical outcome. but we will often do mechanistic studies that qualify as clinical trials, other interventions, smoking cessation, dietary change. These all fall underneath the broad umbrella of clinical trials. And as a behavior change specialist, we don't just come up with these behavioral treatments or these clinical trials out of thin air. My work is really informed by the ORBIT framework from the National Cancer Institute, which helps us think about behavioral interventions or exercise in this context as a drug. We want to take our behaviors and make sure that they're in a biomedical approach. You wouldn't just out of thin air create a drug in a lab and then deploy it at a population level. Similarly, from a behavioral perspective or for physical activity, if we're trying to address a significant clinical question, there are ways by which we should design, refine, and test our interventions to know for sure that they're efficacious and that we have the most efficient designs. So as you might have picked up from the name of my lab, I'm really passionate about survivorship. And when we're thinking about interventions and clinical trials and survivorship, I like to point out that survivorship is actually a critical part of the cancer control continuum, not just focusing clinical trials on detection or screening, which are critical parts of understanding population health and controlling cancer. I'm way on the right here to think about an individual after they've completed treatment or as they're on maintenance therapies to help address some of their health promotion needs, coping with their new identity, and ultimately lowering the risk for negative outcomes. Cancer survivorship means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I subscribe to the NCI's definition from the Office of Cancer Survivorship, where a cancer survivor is a person from the moment they're diagnosed throughout the balance of their life. And cancer survivorship concerns aren't just about recurrence or mortality. Of course, these are significant outcomes for all of us. However, individuals with a cancer diagnosis have unique and combined physical, mental, social, or financial effects, whether they're primarily due to their treatment, their new identity, fear of recurrence, et cetera. So when an individual, when we're thinking about the survivorship experience, these aren't just the late effects of treatment. Quality of life is front of mind, cancer recurrence, second cancers. These are all critical things to address. And throughout my talk, I'll explain how physical activity and exercise are key parts to address multiple dimensions here. Unfortunately, I've got really good job security. Currently, as it stands, there's about 16 to 17 million cancer survivors in the United States, depending on how you measure. This is a seminal publication from 2016. It was called Anticipating the Silver Tsunami. And I really like this figure. I think it says a lot because it shows that by 2040, we are going to have more cancer survivors than ever before. About 10 million more than we currently have. And not only will we have more cancer survivors, the demographic composition of them will be different, such that we'll have more and older cancer survivors, which have the unique and additive benefits of both aging and potentially due to their cancer treatment. So we need to be prepared for this uptick in demand at the population level. I hope you've heard by now that Iowa is one of the rare, not in a good sense, states. We actually have increasing cancer incidence rates. So 2022, we had 20-ish thousand new cases. Just in 2023, we had about 23,000 new cases of cancer across the state. Most places in the United States, it's going down. For us, she's going up. And across all 99 counties, we have about 168 survivors across the state. This is great news because people aren't dying from their cancer. Our mortality rates are quite stable. Unfortunately, when you have new cases and these folks are surviving their disease, we have a lot more folks to serve and address some of their survivorship concerns. Of course, not all cancer survivors are the same. From the wonderful Iowa Cancer Consortium, we can see the distribution of those sites across the state. Not surprising, some of our most common cancer survivor populations are breast, prostate, and colorectal. Now, these are diseases that have really good screening and detection to detect their cancers, and they're also quite common in our population. I'll tell you that in the second half of the talk, I'm going to briefly describe ovarian cancer, which is on the left column. There's about 9,000 endometrial cancer survivors in Iowa. It's about 5% of all the individuals in Iowa. All the cancer survivors in Iowa. So we know that not all cancer survivors are the same in terms of their health promotion needs. We do have a blanket statement from the American College of Sports Medicine, both in the role of exercise and physical activity, which has been found to both prevent cancer and to address some symptoms for folks after they've been diagnosed. So these are two reports that came out in 2019 and really changed the field. As a result of these international expert roundtables, they reported about 8 commonly reported symptoms that survivors experience. And those are pictured on the bottom of the screen. So for example, cancer survivors often have a disproportionate burden of anxiety and depression, significant cancer-related fatigue related to treatment, and these things can contribute independently or jointly to lowered health-related quality of life. The seminal report summarized the state of the evidence for aerobic exercise, that which increases your heart rate, for resistance exercise, that which strengthens your muscle, or the combination of the two, to reveal that these different doses of exercise are associated with differential improvements in individuals. So for example, if a patient has cancer, or if a survivor has cancer-related fatigue, whether aerobic exercise, resistance exercise, or a combination of the two, that has been shown to reduce and manage their symptoms, providing more evidence for the role of exercise as medicine. These guidelines are summarized in a lay report to the public in the following way: that the American College of Sports Medicine says that cancer survivors should generally avoid inactivity, which is the same for everybody on this call. They should aim to do at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity. It's about 2.5 hours per week. That's moderate intensity to get your heart rate up, breathing a little heavy, break a small sweat in regular temperatures, not like today. They should also do strength training exercises on at least 2 days per week. And this is a unique and often under-focused recommendation for cancer survivors. And in addition, it's recommended to spread physical activity out throughout the week such that it's not just big doses on Saturday or Sunday, for example. Despite these, oopsies. Let's try again. Sorry, it just went to the end of my slideshow. So despite these significant recommendations, here we are. The prevalence rates for physical activity are surprisingly low, depending on what surveillance data set you use. Fewer than 1 in 10, or maybe even 2 in 10 cancer survivors actually meet this guideline. So we know that this exercise is associated with improvements in symptom burden. We know it lowers their risk for developing cancer or even secondary cancers, but we know that these behaviors are quite low in the population. And that's where our lab comes in to sort of bridge that gap. The lab group that I direct, which is excellent, our mission is to use exercise to improve both the quantity and quality of life. Like Bree talked about in the introduction, we do both epidemiologic studies and we do our behavioral clinical trials to help improve those items on the left side of the screen. So symptom improvement, improve strength and fitness, and then building those behavior change skills such that these behaviors can be sustained. So for the second half of my talk, I want to explain and give some examples of some of the behavioral treatments we've been able to develop and test and refine. So when we're thinking about defining and creating clinical trials that are behavioral in nature, it's really important that we, one, not only use a behavior change theory to describe what's happening, what are the mechanisms, how are people learning, but we also need to use that orbit framework for understanding our population and our problem. Well, we'll often start with something for endometrial cancer. These individuals have very low uptake of exercise behaviors. So based on NHANES data, it's about 9% of all endometrial cancer survivors do both strength and aerobic exercise. From clinical data, we also see that these individuals have great clinical prognoses after treatment, but they often have impaired strength and low muscle mass. So when we're thinking about designing an intervention, our significant clinical question that we want to focus on, or our clinical endpoint, we want to focus on both exercise behaviors and improving strength, which is a key health outcome. Within this framework, when we're thinking about exercise as a treatment, one of the significant things to focus on, especially for a state like Iowa, is making sure we are designing interventions and approaches that are scalable at a population level and that can reach folks in those rural and remote areas to facilitate those long-term changes. So when we first talk about designing these interventions, much in the way that you would design a drug, you want to be very intentional about your population and with the study. So our line of research started back in Wisconsin, And to address this strength and exercise question, we developed and tested a remote home-based approach. And I always make the joke that we did this back in 2018 before it was cool, before the pandemic sort of forced everybody to go remote. So what we did was design a home-based approach, and we gave individuals a bunch of support, behavior change techniques, and tools to do the exercises at home. The video you see on the screen is the study coordinator describing a biceps curl, which was one of the things provided to participants as a reminder for what the movement is, what muscles are targeting, what are some of the things to avoid. For example, don't snap the band down to avoid injury. The dose of exercise here was 10 weeks of twice weekly strength training. We only asked them to do 20 sessions of this. And the muscle groups, the intervention was targeting all major muscle groups. In this design, we had 40 women who were non-metastatic. We had stages from 1 to 3C, and they were randomized to either receive the exercise treatment at the beginning, or they had to wait until the end of the study to receive the treatment. And then we compared the two groups. And in this population, they were about 63 years old with a BMI of about 40. And this is exactly what you would expect with this population. Endometrial cancer is often diagnosed in the postmenopausal phase, and it's one of our cancers that's most tightly linked to obesity. So this high BMI is not at all surprising. When I talk about giving them tools and doing remote-based studies, we provide a lot of support for these individuals, as most of them have no prior experience with strength training. In fact, we got a lot of consumer input from individuals saying, I don't want to throw out my back, I don't want to deadlift, I've got a bad back. These things are super common, but they're often misconceptions. The exercise program we designed was low impact and low intensity intentionally. One, these folks were often very deconditioned, and two, we want to be very intentional with our progression scheme to not induce injury. Every participant got a personalized exercise prescription. We educated on sets and reps. How do we quantify volume? We educated on intensity. How do you describe to me what maximum effort feels like? How do you describe 70% of your capability? So there was a ton of health education that went into this. Individuals got access to an exercise manual. We provided tablets for folks that didn't have internet access. A private YouTube channel with one of those videos I just showed. We gave them the exercise equipment, and then a lot of the education also on the anatomical elements. A lot of strength training comes from bodybuilding or performance-based frameworks, and it can be really intimidating for folks when you start talking about traps and lats and buys. It becomes a gatekeeping mechanism such that people can't access the behavior. So we designed this image here to sort of explain what these muscle groups look like to help facilitate that learning. So when I say quads, I'm actually talking about that purple on the front of your thigh on the left image there. So these are all based in behavior change theory to help an individual learn and sustain their behavior. One of the main outcomes we measured, like I talked about the clinical question, we used something called the senior fitness test or the functional fitness test battery. Some people call it the short performance physical battery. Now, this is a 7-item assessment of different dimensions of strength. So we tested their strength, agility, flexibility, and aerobic capacity. And good news, when we measured the effect sizes, which is that little italic D there, it's a measure of the strength of the effect for the intervention group compared to the other group. We saw pretty large effects for both upper and lower body strength, which is really good for us to get that type of feedback to know that our intervention is moving the target in the way that we're expecting. What was unexpected was that we actually saw improvements in their agility. Now, that effect size of 0.9 is anywhere between small, or it's between large and medium, which is interesting, suggesting some sort of potential neuromuscular adaptation because an individual has to get their brain to communicate with their periphery for strength training. So not only for our clinical outpoints for participant strength, we saw improvements, but when we looked at their logs for their tracking of their behavior, we also saw that participants were self-reporting progressive overload, which is one of the fundamental principles by which we know that muscles adapt. Any muscle will improve if trained. One cannot continue to lift the same amount of weight. It's simply insufficient stimulus once the adaptation has occurred. So in this older postmenopausal population that had never strength trained before, this is really promising data that always makes me excited that they're able to sort of hit that behavioral target and understand this key component of the intervention. So we're able to have some promising preliminary data for that design phase. One of the limitations of our work, though, was very focused on strength. We didn't necessarily address that aerobic component, which is key. We need both. It's not just the muscles. We need to make sure that we're improving cardiovascular health. That includes aerobic fitness and aerobic endurance. So since coming to the University of Iowa, I've been supported on an ACS IRG, which is a one-year pilot study, where we were able to take that approach that we had done previously and optimize it and refine it to test and see the outcomes in this population with the addition of aerobic activity. So this was led by my wonderful research assistant, Andrea Babcock, pictured on the bottom right side of the screen. So what we did for this study, we similarly took the baseline assessments. We asked them to exercise at home using those same behavior change techniques, giving them sufficient support. And then we did a post-intervention visit where we could compare the outcomes. Now, this is really helpful scientifically to compare to our prior work. What is the magnitude of change? Are we going in the right direction here? Now, this was Andrea's thesis, and she made sure that when working with these participants, that there were theory-informed and behavior change techniques that were replicable for future work. So one of the key components we added with this approach was weekly health coaching, where Andrea met with them. We provided them with health information, which is the middle and right side of the screen, explaining the movement, what muscle groups are using, how to make it harder or easier. But then we also included other components to help with their behavior, including education, demonstrating the behavior, and Andrea serving as a health coach was a key part of social support to help their behavior change. So what we found for improvements in strength, we similarly measured pre to post differences. And for this group, we saw even larger improvements in terms of our effect size estimates for both our upper body strength, but we saw meaningful improvements for lower body strength as well, our agility, our aerobic capacity, and our flexibility here. And just to remind you what had been done previously, where we saw basically a similar large effect in upper body strength, and the lower body strength is still pretty high. But what this is telling us is that there are multiple dimensions moving here. With that 6-minute walk test, that's one of our key metrics for aerobic capacity, which is one of those behavioral targets we want to hit for improving aerobic exercise or cardiovascular fitness. So the good news is that these are improving both in the same direction. And the even better news is we are taking our findings both in our early phase work for designing and testing the intervention. We're currently preparing an application for an efficacy trial where we can definitively test these two approaches against each other or against waitlist controls. When we're thinking about clinical trial development, it's always this optimization for how we refine and tweak our approaches such that we're making the best impact on our significant clinical question. So with that, I'd like to thank the American Cancer Society for funding this work. I'm also supported by funding from the National Cancer Institute, and that's my cute little lab on the right side. They're all wonderful, brilliant scientists.
Wow, that was super interesting. Thank you so much, Dr. Gorzelitz. Now we'll turn it over to Dr. Afifi. Afterwards, we'll have a quick Q&A, so please hold on to any questions you may have for both presenters. Dr. Afifi?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. That was just such an amazing presentation, Jess, and particularly the clear intentional movement along the phases that shows so beautifully how well-designed studies that are evidence-based progress. Thanks so much for doing that. I'm going to be talking at a little bit of a different part of the continuum of thinking through evidence-based interventions, and particularly talking about less about sort of results and more about the challenges that we've had in recruiting rural adolescents to participate in e-cigarette research. So a lot of the work that we do is population-based, community-based, and thinking about how do we contextualize evidence-based interventions to the particular spaces and populations that we're working with. I have a little bit of a cold, so that's what you're hearing in my voice, but we're going to get through this. All right. Oops. Let me see here. It's not moving. There we go. So the research that I'm going to be talking about is funded through grants from the University of Iowa Cancer Prevention Control Research Network and from a grant from the Iowa Department of Public Health. And the specific, again, this is part of the CPCRN's grant that was 2019 to 2024. And the specific aim that was related to the work that I'm going to be talking about was reduce cancer risk by preventing rural youth from using cigarettes and e-cigarettes through the adaptation and testing of evidence-based ecological interventions designed to prevent tobacco use among young people. And before I get into sort of what the challenges were, I want to talk about a little bit about why we're focusing on rural youth, and then what we know about evidence-based interventions in rural areas. So in terms of rural adolescents and tobacco use, I'm going to share some studies that have been published around the disparities in tobacco use amongst rural adolescents and urban adolescents. And I saw that Jess also had shown in one of her slides the disparities in rural. So there is this understanding that rural residents have disparities in many aspects of behaviors related to cancer and also cancer. So what this will show is that both middle school students and high school students are more likely in rural areas to be using conventional cigarettes and also to be using smokeless tobacco. All right, so we know that rural young people, adolescents and young adults, are using some kinds of tobacco more than urban adolescents. This study similarly shows that. So it shows, sorry, I will say that both of these papers are using data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey. This last one I showed before this one was from 2011 to 2016, and the current one is from 2011 to 2014. And so you'll see here that rural young people are more likely to be using cigarettes, more likely to be using smokeless tobacco, more likely to be using multiple tobacco products, and more likely to be using any tobacco products than urban adolescents. And further, from the same paper, when they looked at sort of what were the predictors of current tobacco use among young people aged 11 to 17, rural residency came out as a significant predictor for cigarettes and smokeless. So again, it looks like there is a disparity in some tobacco use for rural adolescents as compared to urban adolescents. The other thing that we know is that, as is really important, it is clear that we should be using evidence-based interventions that when we start to think about implementing interventions in any context. But what we know about rural areas is that evidence-based interventions are much less likely to be used, partially because of lower resources, both human and other resources. But more importantly, perhaps, that there's very few evidence-based interventions that have been developed in and for rural areas specifically. So what is part of the problem in rural spaces is that rural areas are expected to implement evidence-based interventions that are developed and evaluated in urban spaces that are very different in so many ways from rural spaces. And they are expected to do that with far few resources. And so there's many challenges in using evidence-based interventions for various behaviors in rural settings. So as part of this AIM 3, we had come up with a beautiful plan, a beautiful plan for what we wanted to do. So we wanted to start off first by doing some formative qualitative research where we talked with high school students and middle school students in rural and urban areas across Iowa, as well as parents and teachers through interviews and focus groups discussions. We also wanted to talk with organizations and individuals who were implementing e-cigarette interventions for adolescents to understand what works, what doesn't work, what's a facilitator, what's a barrier, and all that to more carefully understand the patterns and contexts of use of e-cigarettes in adolescents and young adults, and particularly adolescents in middle and high school, in Iowa and rural areas, and to understand what is working generally in that space. And based on that, we had hoped to develop innovative interventions for middle and high school students. We kept saying something as sexy as Juul, but health promotive as opposed to not. And so maybe was it app-based? Is it gaming? Using the results of the formative research and information on effective e-cigarette, social media, app-based interventions that were starting to be established in 2019, as well as guidance that we could find from national experts. And in addition, to develop supportive interventions for parents and teachers, and then pilot test and evaluate those interventions. That was our beautiful plan. So we started off thinking about, all right, if we were going to do this work, what schools would we want to work with? We wanted to have school-based interventions to start with. So we took that original aim and expanded to rural, peri-urban, which are sort of our micropolitan communities, and urban. And we did a ton of research very early on in sort of 2019, looking at Iowa youth tobacco use surveys across all counties, and noticing which were the counties that had higher rates of tobacco use, because we thought we'd start there. And we also looked at National Center for Education statistics to sort by rurality. So did a lot of research to try to prioritize which specific counties and schools we would be working in. And that was excellent. And we had a plan that was gonna, that was gonna be a go. And then COVID hit, which basically stopped all of our work, because the whole point was to be doing, work in person and with young people and parents and teachers, and really schools were in just a confusing space at that time, didn't know if they were going to continue, not continue, and they definitely didn't want to add anything more to the work that they were already doing, which is totally understandable. And just as we were starting to get going again, then in August of 2020, we had the derecho, which really destroyed some school infrastructure. And so after that, we sort of stepped back again and did a whole bunch of second wave school research before the 2020-21 school year to look at what were the back to school plans for schools, what was their offering of technology availability to students, were they providing financial assistance for Wi-Fi, what was the derecho impact, to again prioritize particular schools that might be able to continue this work with us if we sort of reached out to them. And as we were doing that, we assembled a small advisory group of both people in sort of the Department of Public Health and the school system that were interested in school-based tobacco research to help us think through what might be the best way to do this. How do we approach schools right now? What schools might we be able to do? And we had a short list by that time of schools that we wanted to think about moving forward based on our Wave 1 and Wave 2 research, and asked them to both provide information about the school choices that we had already made, as well as suggest new schools. And based on their suggestions, we went back and did some additional research on those new schools and had a final vote by the advisors and picked 4 schools that we were going to work in, an urban school, a micropolitan school, and 2 rural schools that generally had high rates of tobacco use, and which with whom we had pre-existing connections, either through our advisory group or ourselves, because our advisory group was really clear that we needed to have a connection in school to even make this possible. Great. At that point, we started to contact the school district, sometimes superintendent, depending on the school district and the county. So in bigger counties like Cedar Rapids, we went straight to the school principal, but in smaller spaces, we went to superintendents. We sent an introductory email, a follow-up email. We made 3 phone calls, and we left 1 voicemail, and basically got crickets. I think of everybody we contacted, we might have gotten 1 person that we were able to talk to on the phone, but otherwise there was nothing. Right? Despite having our connection to the school reach out, like there was really crickets. So we sort of stepped back and thought about, all right, what was our next step? And while we were thinking about that, came across this Post-Secret post. And I'm sure most of you know what Post-Secret is, but Post-Secret is an ongoing community mail art project where people basically mail in comments or secrets that they don't necessarily want anybody to know about. It's totally anonymous. And we found this, which we thought was a really great post about why we had been getting crickets. So it says, I know COVID is hard on my students, family, staff, teachers, and community, but running a school right now feels impossible and thankless. I have to be strong, positive, and brave for everybody. I'm exhausted. I just had to tell somebody the principal is not okay. So based on that, we decided we needed to pivot. And our first pivot was to forget about parents and teachers for now, and only focus on adolescents, to shift from schools to youth-serving organizations, like maybe we'd be able to access young people in youth-serving organizations. And Iowa DHHS through Johnson County and Powachick County had a small grant that allowed us to continue to do this work. So we focused specifically on those two counties. And in our methodology, we shifted from focus group discussions, which also had, and I'll talk about this a little later, the IRB was uncomfortable with focus group discussions and also, by the way, required active consent, which I'll talk about also later, to concept mapping. I don't know how many of you know about concept mapping, but it's a really interesting online platform where you basically provide a prompt to anybody that's a participant, and the participants then respond to the prompts in as many responses as they want. And then what's really nice about concept mapping is instead of sort of a usual qualitative method like focus group discussions or interviews, where after the participants give you the information, the researcher does the analysis, concept mapping allows the participants to sort of do the analysis. So it asks them to combine all of the answers that anybody has generated into themes, and then furthermore to sort of prioritize the themes. So the participants themselves get to do some of the analysis. So our prompt was something that makes people my age not want to vape is. So we also took a protective factors approach. And participants were able to individually brainstorm as many words or phrases or ideas that they could in response to this prompt, and then sort them into categories of their own determination. So once there's always a phase one where everybody provides brainstorm. And then in phase two, everybody gets in and sees what everybody has prioritized, obviously anonymously, and gets to sort everything into these categories. And then goes to rate the importance of each of the categories in relation to that prompt, okay? Now, ideally, you want at least 40 participants to be able to analyze patterns accurately. Without 40, you just don't have enough. We invited 9 youth-serving organizations in these 2 counties. Every single one of them thought the topic was relevant. Only 33 of the 9 felt that they had the capacity to engage, which again shows the difficulties of resources. And within that, parent consent was also an issue because they have direct contact with the young people who've been signed up, but not necessarily, they don't necessarily want to go back to the parents and ask them if they can do a particular study. And I'll get back to this as well. So since we felt we were not going to have enough with the youth-serving organizations, we did a second pivot, which was to shift to mass email. We thought, all right, we can send out a mass email to university faculty and staff at Grinnell College for Powachick County and at the University of Iowa for Johnson County. Grinnell refused, and this is not uncommon because we didn't have a PI at Grinnell, so they would not send out our mass email. And we were on a short time frame, so we weren't able to reach out and engage in an authentic way anybody from Grinnell to be a co-I. So we weren't able to send out that email to Grinnell. We were able to send it out to the University of Iowa, but we only wanted young people who were living in Johnson County because that was the grant requirement. Together, this pivot 1 and 2 led us to 84 parents that consented to allow the child to participate, 7 of whom were ineligible either because the age of the child was inappropriate or they weren't in Johnson County. 77 children were invited. 28% of the children assented, 27 began the brainstorming activity, only 14 completed the brainstorm activity, and only 10 completed the second phase, which was sorting and rating. So as I had said earlier, we need at least 40 to make this relevant. So at that point, we really had to step back and think about what we felt like we had really tried to get to young people and we're having a lot of difficulty reaching them, and maybe we needed to pivot completely to some other idea. So this sort of shows you the how we progressed in trying to meet our original goals. So in spring and fall of 2020, we were trying to work within the schools. We had the pandemic and the derecho, and there was we weren't able to access schools. We pivoted in spring 2021 to do these youth organizations. 9 were invited, 3 agreed to participate. We did another pivot in summer, fall of 2021 to the mass emails, and you know that only 10 completed the phase. So what we sort of did, and this was Haley Bomar, who was the research assistant then, started to sort of think through what are all the various challenges that prevented us from reaching our goal of like talking to young people about the context in which they're using or not using e-cigarettes. So I'm going to go through some of these at the various ecological systems. And I think it's really interesting to see it this way because every project faces barriers at many of these levels. So one was our institutional IRB. So our institutional IRB at the University of Iowa required us to do active parental consent. So just to explain, active parental consent means that parents have to agree to allow their child to participate in this research project. A passive parental consent is when you send information to the parents and kids are enrolled unless the parents actively says they don't want them to be engaged, right, or to participate. So that's the difference. And in various studies, you have to think, what makes active versus passive parental consent more okay or more ethical. Many of the research projects that have been able to enroll young people in tobacco control research studies have used passive consent. And the I don't know if it's an argument or the dialogue here is, which is more risky for young people? Is it more risky to be engaged in a project where they're sharing their thoughts and beliefs and experiences around tobacco use in a context? In a context that they're already, so you're not engaging them in trying anything new. They're just sharing their beliefs and experiences. Or is it more risky to actually be talking to their parents who may not know that they're using or not, who may not know their context about about participation? And we argued to the IRB that there may actually be more risk for young people to be talking to their parents about this than there is to actually engage in the study where we're asking about their thoughts and perceptions about what might make vaping in this point less likely. The IRB didn't buy it. They stuck to active consent. We think that created a lot of barriers to our enrolling young people. So that's sort of the first thing. The second was the IRB also had concerns about particularly the focus group discussions earlier, and we did engage with them on changing the focus group discussions. They were concerned that young people getting into a focus group space may be sharing information about their substance use, which other people in that space may not know about, and therefore there was a risk of confidentiality being broken. And I think we would agree with that. And so we did pivot, and in the concept mapping, it's an individual thing rather than in terms of an anonymity rather than sort of in a space where there's collectivity. There are always environmental events that happen, and particularly for us, this happened at a time of two quite big environmental events, the pandemic and the derecho. And this really caused, particularly in a school system, exhaustion from the conditions of both of those events and the impact that it had on the school systems, and the significant extra workload that the school-based personnel, but also, as we saw, our nonprofit youth personnel were facing, which made it difficult. The organizers were really eager to participate. So the youth organizations were really eager, but they're often understaffed and don't have the capacity to participate, even when they think that the topic's really important and they're really eager to participate. And so, for example, in Poacha County, we had one youth organization that agreed, and it yielded 0 participants from there. The other thing specifically in rural spaces is to think about the access to, internet capacity. So that was an issue. And then the specific design of the concept mapping platform is not intuitive. And I think we needed to do a lot more work sort of helping participants know how to use the system. I think Jess showed some amazing ways of how they supported people to get onto the intervention that they were doing. In this case, it was just for to give us information. So some of our takeaways from doing this work is that there are many barriers to adolescent participation in research related to substance use at many ecological levels, parental, community, institutional, and societal levels, that we would argue that, at least for research that we're talking about, passive parental consent may actually protect young people more than active parental consent. And that active parental consent potentially poses a risk to young people due to the disclosure of experiential knowledge or some activities that they're involved in that their parents don't know about. that gaining trust, as we know, is really important in recruiting and retraining adolescents in e-cigarette research, and that perhaps working through youth-serving organizations can help that trust, or establishing advisory boards. And that youth-serving organizations are an underutilized resource for partnership development and health promotion efforts with young people, but that we need to be really thinking about how to minimize their workload if we're asking them to do that. And that rural youth face additional barriers to participation in web-based studies, and that all this made us think that really in-person recruitment and research activities should be pursued whenever possible with young people and substance use. So those are our takeaway. As we were doing this, we also sort of had an important consideration that we're now keeping in mind. And what we know, and all of you know, and are finding out more, is that adolescents and young adults rarely use one tobacco product or even one substance by itself. But we often are siloed. So not only do we do interventions that are like in tobacco, we do cigarette prevention interventions, and then e-cigarette prevention interventions, like all these separate interventions, not knowing at all what they're doing to the other substances that young people are using, or alcohol-specific use interventions, when we know that young people are using all of these interventions together. So we've been thinking a lot now about how do we create substance use interventions that really work with young people around all the substances they're using and may have less risk at increasing one while we're decreasing another. So that's sort of a pathway that we are taking based on this. The other path that we're taking is that we've shifted to young adults that are 18 plus, so we don't have the IRB issues around parental consent. And I'll stop there just in the interest of time, and I'm open to your thoughts, your questions, or your epiphanies. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Afifi and Dr. Gorzelitz. Does anyone have questions or comments? You can unmute yourself, or you can drop them in the chat. One question that I had for Dr. Gorzelitz was sort of about scalability of these survivorship programs, and how it feels like sometimes, for me as a, oncologist seeing patients, I talk about survivorship in clinic and, things that patients can be doing, but it does seem like more of an infrastructure is required to really help people. And it just seems like sometimes we try to do this on a small scale when it really should be looked at on a larger scale. And I was wondering if you have thoughts about how we might achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it's one that I deal with all the time, quite honestly, because, if it's 10 to 20% of cancer survivors are meeting the guidelines, I can't, like 80% of 160, I can just tell you is not quantifiable. Like our lab can't handle that. And we can see in our formative work, Dr. Afifi talked about our qualitative work. We've really drilled down into endometrial cancer, for example, where these folks have a lot of, there's a lot of obesity, there's a lot of weight stigma, there's a lot of negative past experiences. And overwhelmingly, we hear that patient population does not want social support or competition or like a big group thing that is often seen, for example, in breast cancer. So we can't be saying that one size fits all. So, there is this rub, right, between the behavioral science and proving efficacy and demonstrating that these are the most efficient approaches, but then also scale. The American College of Sports Medicine also has this component called assess, advise, refer, where physicians should here, be counseling every one of their patients about exercise. They should be evaluating exercise behaviors. Are they meeting the guidelines? And I don't think the answer is that every patient or every survivor comes to see me. We need some sort of infrastructure, health systems place to connect patients with where they are and what they need. So I focus a lot about the remote approaches to focus on rural places. I haven't talked at all about Live Strong programs at the YMCA. There's always cancer exercise trainers to work one-on-one with folks. scientifically, I feel like everybody's in their own little corner trying to do their own little thing. And I don't know what the answer is for bringing everyone together, codifying this, protocolizing it such that we can connect the dots. I'm not answering your question, but it's a big problem that we see in exercise oncology broadly. There's not one answer. My studies are great, but I don't think it'll work for everyone. And how do you make that change on a big scale is a great question.
I'll jump into real quick, Dr. Afifi. So, you focused on rural communities in this research. I just was wondering if you think the effects of COVID and the derecho would be similar in other settings like urban communities as it would of rural, or like what you think those kind of stark differences are between different community types and the effects of those two events.
It's a good question. I think the main difference is in extent of resources. Yeah, I mean, so yes, I think all school systems were affected by COVID, and the pivot for school systems onto remote, for many of them went either remote or partially remote. I mean, that was a huge effort that everybody had to make, and then they had to repivot, right? I mean, so I think all school systems were affected. And likely in the time period where that was happening, they didn't have much bandwidth for anything else. I mean, that's what we're hearing across the nation, right? There wasn't bandwidth, in addition to their own dealing with COVID and, everything that COVID did to us. They wanted to make sure that they got the basically writing, reading, and arithmetic done, what they had to do without extra. So we know that other programs around dating violence and all those things just basically went away during COVID. So absolutely, I think we would have probably had the same type of response from urban schools.
It looks like there's a question in the chat. It says, Dr. Afifi, I'm curious about your thoughts on Iowa not participating. Okay, you can read that.
Yeah, I saw that. I think there's a lot of things that are happening in Iowa that are going to make it much more difficult for us to know what's really happening with young people and to do contextual work. So I'm quite concerned. It's also why I think it's really important that we document all of this. There is so many sociopolitical factors that are going to be influencing our ability to implement interventions. First, to figure out, what interventions are needed, what the state of well-being for young people is, well-being broadly defined, but then also to be able to implement interventions, at least in school spaces. So there's quite a lot of concern, and all of us should be concerned about this, and all of us should be documenting the changes that we're seeing on the ground.
Okay, well, if there are any more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. While we wait for those, though, Kelly, if you would like to give us some consortium updates.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Kelly Sittig over at the Iowa Cancer Consortium. And first of all, thanks so much to Dr. Gorzelitz and Dr. Afifi. We just really appreciate your time so much, and your knowledge and your expertise and your willingness to share with us. I'm just going to provide a few quick updates of things you might want to know about that are happening at the consortium. If you haven't had enough Iowa Cancer Consortium today, you can join us at 3 p.m. today for the Cancer Screening and Early Detection work group meeting from 3 to 4. It is also virtual on Zoom. And this great image that you see here about survivor-led cervical cancer screening education in Iowa, and our two wonderful speakers here, that is the meeting today. So you won't want to miss it. If you're able to attend, that would be great. We also have a couple additional work group meetings coming up. There's a quality of life meeting on July 11th, HPV on July 17th. And then, of course, if you haven't heard already, We're not doing our jobs, I don't think. Hopefully you have heard, but the Iowa Cancer Summit is happening this year on October 15th in Ankeny again. And the big news is that Dr. Kimron Rathmel, who is the director of the National Cancer Institute, is going to be our very special guest and keynote. We are incredibly lucky to have her coming. So we would love to see you all there. It's going to be a huge year for the summit. So the more, the merrier. Oh, and thanks, Caroline. Caroline dropped the link to other events, so you can see everything that's happening at the consortium if you're interested. And of course, always reach out to us. Oh, thanks. Liz dropped the summit link, and I'm going to put the staff at Cancer Iowa email in the chat. You can always email us if you have questions or need anything else. Let's see, did we have any other questions pop up for our awesome speakers? Okay. Well, with that, thank you so much, everybody. Again, to our speakers, thanks for joining us for the Research and Clinical Trials Roundtable. Keep your eyes open for an email with resources shared today, as well as the post-evaluation survey. And again, thank you, Dr. Gorzelitz and Afifi, for your presentations. Hope to see you all next time. Take care and enjoy the sunshine. Thanks, everybody.